there's nothing to say that Red Bull continuing the way they operate right now will work through 2026 and beyond. The early Ron Dennis years, or my early Ron Dennis years, Ron put too much value on the things that he believed in that weren't necessarily in line with the values of the people in the organization. Hi, I'm Marc Priestley. I spent 10 years working at the McLaren Formula 1 team with the likes of Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Raikkonen, Fernando Alonso, Mika Hakkinen. But those are just the drivers. I also worked with amazing people behind the scenes. Adrian Newey, Ron Dennis. They all taught me valuable lessons that I now know are not just applicable to Formula 1. My mission with this podcast is to help you to think more like a Formula 1 team might think about the challenges you might face in life, on a personal level, on a business level, being a parent, social challenges that you face. I hope you'll take away some valuable lessons that will help you on your own journey towards high performance. Welcome to Pitlane Life Lessons. Hey everybody, and welcome back to not just a brand new episode, but a brand new season of the Pitlane Life Lessons podcast. I'm very, very excited because it has been a minute, hasn't it, since we spoke to each other. And actually, in this brand new series, I hope it's a step up, both in terms of production values, the way we can promote it, but also, for the very first time, you're going to see episodes that don't just include me, but some episodes will have insights from other people from within the world of Formula 1, learning from both their journeys through this wonderful sport, but how the sport has touched them, and obviously, importantly, the lessons they've learnt from that we can pass on and share with you. So lots to look forward to. Today, though, it is just me. Sorry if you're expecting others, but it's just me. But today I want to talk about some things that have cropped up in my world recently that I feel are super important. I'm talking about them more and more outside of Formula 1 with a lot of the work that I do with companies and organisations. And the first of those topics really centres around the fact that we are all living in a changing world. Now, that may come as absolutely no surprise. We all know that, obviously. The world is changing rapidly in all sorts of ways. And we are having to adapt to that. We're having to react to that, but we're also having to try and be proactive to make the best of that changing environment, the changing world. And I know that it affects everybody in different ways. I can think of some of the new technologies that are coming through, for example, in the world. Think about AI, the new wave of technologies coming through, which are going to change everything that we do. If we do not embrace those, and if we don't look for the opportunities that those technologies present to us, we will get left behind. This is, as an example, just for things like AI. It's a huge change, one of the biggest technological changes that the world has seen. So just as an example, we have to learn to find the way through that, navigate through that path, and come out the other side in the strongest position possible. Because the alternative is we get very quickly left behind, and whatever lovely position we're in right now, if the world changes, we could end up falling down the order. And the reason this has come to the surface recently is because I'm thinking about the competitive order in Formula 1. I'm thinking about Mercedes as a particular example, who've been through years of difficulty, of struggle, of desperately trying to adapt their car and redesign their car, change it to get on par with others who are already a step ahead. And this is coming off the back of years of dominance from Mercedes in Formula 1. And there was a podcast that I listened to recently, an interview with James Allison. It was F1's Beyond the Grid podcast. Wonderful conversation with him. I highly recommend it, and I'll actually link it in the description as well if you want to go and check it out. But there was a particular line that he delivered in that interview, which I thought was particularly pertinent to all of us, because he was talking, when he said it, about Formula 1 and about Mercedes' car and how they designed that car and how they think they're now finding a new path, a new direction for development of that Formula 1 car. They've had a kind of eureka moment, or a moment where they have discovered perhaps where they were going wrong, and as a result of that, where they might be able to go now in a better direction. His reflection on that moment, when I listened to it, as I try and do with everything in Formula 1, I didn't just hear a conversation about Formula 1 and Formula 1 cars. What I heard in that conversation was a lesson in there that's valuable to all of us. So what I want to do is I'm going to play in the clip of James Allison talking now to the F1 Beyond the Grid podcast. I want you to listen to what he says. Bear in mind that he's obviously talking about designing their Formula 1 car and the way that it looks and how you go through that design process. But in the back of your mind, think about it not as a Formula 1 car. Think about it from your own perspective of your life. And the things that he says, I wonder if you can find a way to apply those to your life. So listen to what he says, and we'll pick it up and talk about it in a moment.
The way that we were set up in the old world worked just fine. And not just fine, it worked for 8 seasons on the trot, something no one has ever done before. It was pretty impressive. We, to a large extent, carried on with that way of working together under different circumstances and were insufficiently self-critical to recognise that there were weaknesses inherent in that approach in the new world that didn't matter in the old. Yeah, we definitely paid a price for that.
So I thought that was fascinating. So James Allison there is talking about the way that under the old regulations in Formula One, the previous set of rules in which they were supremely dominant for a very long period of time, they found a really good way of working. You know, the organisation operated at an extremely high level. The departments within that organisation each excelled at their own disciplines. And he's talking about the different groups like aerodynamics groups, the trackside team that are working on engineering at the track, the vehicle dynamics team. He's talking about in the previous set of regulations, those 3 groups within the organisation operated essentially on their own. They were each very, very good at doing things the way they had to do them to excel within that current regulation set. But under the new rules, under the current generation of cars, which operate very differently, they run very low to the ground, these underfloor aerodynamics and the ground effect that we now rely upon to get much of the performance, demand something completely different from the organisation that's trying to build those cars. Now, what James is talking about in that clip is if you blindly continue down a path that has worked for you in the past, when things change around you, i.e. a set of regulations or a new world, a new way of working, if you blindly continue in the old way of doing things, it's not a guarantee of future success. And Mercedes have lived that. They've seen that. They were excellent. They were literally the benchmark in Formula One. They were doing things at an incredibly high level, but it's no longer working. It's not that they've changed what they do. It's that the environment in which they're operating has changed. And I think there's a really valuable lesson in that because of what I said at the beginning of this podcast. The world is changing massively all of the time. A lot of the time we don't even notice it because it's small, subtle changes. But we can think back to moments like the COVID pandemic, which was a global reset. And you could have looked at that and said, well, that was a huge threat to my existing way of doing things. Or you could look at it as a massive set of opportunities because both were true. And if you look at what came out the other side of the COVID pandemic, yes, it was serious for a lot of people. It caused tragedy for a lot of people. It destabilized a lot of businesses, a lot of industries even. But actually, it also created a huge number of opportunities. New industries were in fact created off the back of COVID. New ways of working. You know, entrepreneurs were emerging out of nowhere, forming new startup businesses. Companies were designing and manufacturing new products that there was no need for in the past. I mean, I myself went from a completely different world in which I was broadcasting and traveling the world with Sky Sports in Formula One. I was presenting on Formula E. COVID brought that to an abrupt end. My career, as it was at that point, was under huge threat. And my response to that was to think, well, the world has changed. We're clearly not going to go back to just doing things the way we were doing them. So I'm going to think differently about it. And actually, my solution to that, at least my perceived solution in the moment, was to go down the route of creating a YouTube channel. I started broadcasting on my own. If no one else was going to put me on the screen, I would do it myself. And that's what happened. I started vlogging daily, every single day, creating a video because I had suddenly time on my hands, which I didn't have before. I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted and say whatever I wanted on my own channel. Didn't have that before. So a changing world had given me a whole new set of opportunities to do something completely different. I was still talking about Formula One. That was still my area of expertise, but I was now able to do it very, very differently. And I loved it. I enjoyed it. I had some success from it, and it sent me off down a completely different path in my career. But that's just my experience. Lots of other people had similar experiences or different experiences, which was all about embracing the change. And the reason this is important for all of us is, as I said, the world is changing constantly. I talked about AI earlier on. If we don't embrace that, we will find many of our industries, many of our careers will be brought to their knees. If you write articles, for example, for a magazine, if you're a journalist, there is no doubt your world is going to change. And if you just plow on continually writing articles in the same way you write them now, which, yes, of course, is the norm. It's what you're very good at. It's what you've been honed at. Your skills have been honed in that way. If you continue doing that over the next 10 years, when generative AI becomes such an impressively efficient tool, you will get left behind because other people will have developed the skill in prompting that AI. And that will be where the skill set lies. Prompting this generative tool to create the article that you want to create. And the skill and the experience will be in being a prompt engineer. It's learning the skill of telling the system what you want out of it to get exactly the result you need. That's a very different world to the one that we live in right now. But if you don't at least consider embracing it, you risk getting left behind. And this was what James Allison was referring to. Mercedes ploughed on working in the way that they had worked under the previous regulations because it had been so successful for them. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you think this is working? We should just carry on. And what he also refers to in this moment of sort of self-analysis is he says, we weren't self-critical enough. We didn't look closely enough at why things weren't working. We didn't look closely enough at how we were doing things to discover what they think they've now discovered is a new route under a new set of regulations that requires something different. And they now are looking at this idea of a vehicle dynamics group working seamlessly with the aerodynamics group, for example, and with the trackside engineering group. Instead of being three separate functions, in the old way of working, there was no real sense in spending too much time and energy integrating them. That would have been almost wasteful of resources because it wasn't required. Today, though, in the new cars, the new generation of Formula One, it absolutely is required. It's not just required, it's an utter necessity. That's been the moment that they have discovered. So now, dealing with the problems that Mercedes, as an example, have been suffering with, the bouncing, the porpoising, some of the vehicle dynamics issues that have hampered the likes of Lewis Hamilton and George Russell inside that car from getting the best out of it. In the old generation, they would have just turned to the vehicle dynamics group. The engineering team would have had to sort of mechanically solve around that problem. But what they now realize is it's not just a mechanical issue. And actually, the whole way that these cars generate downforce and the way that they work has to be seamlessly integrated. It's almost like there's no longer an aerodynamics team and a vehicle dynamics team. It's just one team that has to be seamlessly working in exactly the same direction. They have to be working together. They have to be pulling in the same direction. They've got to solve problems together. So they've had to come up with a new way of understanding how to employ or deploy the resources they have, the people they have, the facilities and the technology at their disposal, all of which has generated massive success over many years for them, sustained success. Well, now those tools and those people, those resources and those facilities, they're still hugely valuable, but they have to deploy them in a different way. And you can relate it back to my example of me switching to YouTube when the original way of me deploying my resources didn't work any longer. It was no longer an opportunity for me to travel the world and broadcast on Formula One or Formula E. I still had the same skill set. I still had the same knowledge and experience that I felt was valuable to other people. I felt a need to share it, but I just had to think of a new way of doing that. And that might be a simplistic argument to say, yes, we just switched from television broadcasting to YouTube as an example. Millions of people, by the way, switched to YouTube or podcasting during COVID. But that's exactly the point. Because the world had changed, it opened up a huge number of opportunities for people to do that, which hadn't been as obvious prior to that point. Mercedes have uncovered exactly the same thing inside their hugely successful organization. The point is, over the last few years, they haven't looked like a hugely successful organization, have they? They've been struggling. They've been in the midfield, sometimes even struggling to get into the midfield. That's been a massive shock for most Formula One fans coming off the back of a period of domination. It's like imagining Max Verstappen right now struggling to get out of Q3. You can't quite get your head around it because they've got Max Verstappen. They've got the brilliance of the people at Red Bull and the facilities and the resources at Red Bull that have generated so much success. But if the rules suddenly change, which they are about to do, by the way, in 2026, who knows what opportunities will be presented to the Formula One teams at that point? There's nothing to say that Red Bull continuing the way they operate right now will work through 2026 and beyond. Guys, I hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. If you can take a very quick moment to like, subscribe, follow, leave me a comment or a 5-star rating, I would really appreciate it. It makes a massive difference to the podcast. Every team will have to reevaluate what's required from a Formula One team to get the best out of what is another new generation of cars. And I thought it was a really valuable insight from James Allison, a really honest insight in that they are now being really self-critical. He's quite harsh. If you listen to the entire interview, and as I said, I recommend you do, because it has a lot of really good insights, not just about Mercedes' current form and their difficulties they've been through, but as I said, lots of these lessons that James is very articulate at communicating about that I think we can translate into life too. This idea of being self-critical is the very first step to uncovering the next set of opportunities. Because when this changing world comes, when the next step of whether it's technology or an environmental shift, it could be a social shift that we're all immersed in, and therefore it might impact our lives. It could be something like a pandemic that changes everybody's lives together. Or it could be much smaller, that just affects your industry. It might be your friend group or even your family. Things change all of the time. And if we're not aware of those changes and openly self-critical enough to analyze ourselves, admit where we might be going wrong, admit where we might have some weaknesses or at least some things that we might be able to do better, but also understand what our strengths are. What do we have at our disposal? What skill sets do we have? What are our technologies if we're in an organization? What are the things, the resources that we built up? What are we good at? Can we redeploy those same skills and resources in a new world to uncover new opportunities? And I think that's something that every single one of us can and probably should every now and again take some time to evaluate about our own lives. This idea in Formula One of debriefing, it's a really important, I've talked about it on this podcast before, it's a really important skill and a really important process to go through. I try and do it through the form of writing a journal every single day, which is my version of debriefing what went the day before. I do it in the morning. So I look back at yesterday, I sort of analyze how I was feeling, what I got up to, what worked and what didn't. And it's a sort of debrief. But we should be doing this on a micro level about the small things that we do every day. But every now and again, it's really useful to have a moment where we debrief the status of our lives. If you're in a business, debrief the status of your organization. What are you winning at? What are you not winning at? What's coming over the horizon in terms of new opportunities? What's changing outside of our organization that might pose a threat or present an opportunity? This idea of debriefing and understanding, or at least trying to understand where the next direction or the next opportunity could be, is a massively valuable tool. Formula One teams do it regularly. And make no mistake, Mercedes will have done this. They haven't been sitting on their laurels for the last 2 years, struggling, wondering why it's not just working. They'll have been debriefing all the time, but they just hadn't thought in a way, and as James said, hadn't been self-critical enough, honest enough about where they might have gone wrong to start then uncovering the future direction. And the great news for them, and maybe for Formula One fans as well, is it seems like they might have done that now. If we can end up with a Mercedes that's back at the front, competing with other teams, with other drivers, making a fight of every Grand Prix weekend that's not just about one team or one driver, along with the likes of McLaren and Ferrari, we've got a wonderful Formula One on our hands. But it's down to the fact that people like James and the team around him were open and honest enough to be really brutal about how they might have failed. Even though they're full of great people and great technology, great resources and all the things I've talked about, they weren't deploying them in the right way. So my lesson from this to you is, what can you do in the same sense? What can you do around your own lives, around your own companies, around the sort of social circles you live in? If we're looking to maximize what we do, and the very fact you're listening to this podcast suggests that you at least have an interest in that. If we're looking to improve and get better, which is what Formula One teams are trying to do all the time, We need to be continually analysing and be honest enough to know and recognise when we're not doing well enough. And once you've recognised that, then go deeper again. What could you do differently? What can you do differently? And start to look over the horizon. What's coming your way? What are the opportunities? Do you have an opportunity to potentially move up in your organization, to go for that promotion? And if someone comes along one day and says, here's the opportunity, would you like to apply for this role? You should be ready for that. You should have already thought about that. You should have already thought about what it is you have at your disposal, what's within your makeup and within your armory to mean that you are ready to go for that. And part of that process is having the regular debriefs, having the regular conversation with yourself about analysing where you stand, where you want to get to, and what the route is between where you are now and where you want to be in the future. That openness and honesty is sometimes one of the most difficult things, one of the most difficult conversations to have, but certainly one of the most important. Now, that's that part of the conversation today. I thought that was a fascinating part of what James Allison was talking about. But later in exactly the same interview, he actually talks about another aspect of what Mercedes have been uncovering on this journey back towards success that he thinks is key to understanding where they need to go in the future. And there's another, for me, very clear life lesson within that. There's another moment here which I'm going to play to you, which I want you to listen to in exactly the same way I asked you to listen to the last one. Think about it, understanding that, of course, he's talking here about designing a Formula One car, about the inputs that you put into that design process, how you go about working out what should go into the pot, into the mix, if you like, into a great big set of ingredients, in the hope that you'll get out the other side exactly what you want to achieve. Have a listen to what he says, but as I said before, all the way through it, have a think about exactly what he's saying and how you can relate that to your life, your business, where you are in any of those different scenarios, and maybe what you can take from it to help get you a bit further down the line.
If a team is incorrectly placing value on stuff at the analytical level, then you will get the wrong geometry at the far side. And there's no point in putting someone else's geometry on the car because your method of valuing it will immediately iterate you away from it back to what you previously valued. You have to understand what to value. And if you understand what to value, the geometry will pop out on its own. The challenge is understanding what to place value on.
Now, what James was talking about there was the design inputs. So what the team place value on in the process of designing a car, and therefore what you get out the other end. And what he means by that in the Formula One context is that if you're getting the inputs wrong right at the base level, at the analytical level, as he talks about, no matter what you think the car should look like, it's not going to end up finalizing there because your base inputs are wrong. What you're putting into that mix is essentially wrong. You don't know that at that point. You think you're doing the right things, but if they are wrong, and sometimes in Formula One, we're talking such fine levels, such tiny amounts, they only need to be wrong by the smallest amount. The measurements or the calculations need to be off by the tiniest number for it then to go through the system and come out spitting out a car at the other end that just doesn't work in the way that you thought it would. He's talking there about understanding which elements to place value on so that you end up getting the right inputs and therefore the right result. He's referring in that conversation to the question from Tom Clarkson initially, which was, if you put this new front wing that Mercedes are now enjoying benefits of onto an old car, would you get better results? Would this new front wing concept have dramatically changed the fortunes of some of your previous cars that struggled? And James's response is talking about the fact that, first of all, it's certainly not just about the front wing, but it's definitely not about the way a car looks. Formula One fans particularly, but the media as well, get a little bit hung up on what a car looks like. We look at a Red Bull that's dominated over the last few years and we say, well, why doesn't everybody just sort of copy their side pod configuration? Why doesn't everybody's car look like a Red Bull? Because clearly that's the way to win here. Look at what they're doing. Look at what they're achieving. And what James is rightly saying here is that actually nobody sets out in Formula One to design a car that looks a certain way, because that's not the component that you place almost any value on. What a Formula One car looks like is almost inconsequential to a team. The only thing that matters is what it performs like. It's how it handles, it's how it operates over the course of a season. So he's saying that if you then understand that your value should be placed on the characteristics of that car, so for example, how it operates over the course of a number of different circuit types over a long season, how it responds to engineering changes, how drivable is it, how usable for the drivers and for the engineers to be able to operate it over a Grand Prix weekend. How reliable, of course, is it? And ultimately, of course, how quick is it going to be? How much downforce can it produce for the efficiency that it also needs? All of those things are the things that Formula One teams need to place value on. They're almost never placing value on the end finished look of that car, which is why it's pointless to say, why don't you take a Red Bull side pod and put it on your car, or a front wing from this car, put it on a different one? Those things don't work because you're placing value on the wrong component, i.e. what it looks like. And the reason this is all fascinating to me, and the very first thing that I heard when I listened to James's answer, was a reflection on what I think is a large part of society. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, how many of us listen to that clip? And if we're really brutally honest, go back to what I talked about before, being self-critical and reflective on who we are and how we operate, how we behave in the world. How many of us place value on the wrong things in life? How many of us, for example, or how many of the people in our circle, the people we know, children and the younger generations especially, with access to a new world in social media where they have access to everybody and everything at their fingertips. How many of those people are seeing others on social media, for example, and wanting to have what they have or to be like they are? How many people are being influenced? We've got a whole new industry, the influencer industry. It didn't exist a few years ago, or certainly not in the way it exists today. How many people are being influenced to want to go for the end result and not be self-critical enough to figure out that actually it's placing value on the inputs we need to put into ourselves to get to that end result? It could be that you see somebody, for example, who looks super successful and they're flaunting their Ferrari, their Lamborghini on social media. That's what you see. And it could end up being that feels like a measure of success for you. It's to have the car or the nice house or whatever the thing is. It might be for some people to look a certain way. You might feel a pressure to look a certain way because someone else looks that way, and look at the success or the enjoyment in life they're having. Look how many followers they've got. But if you're doing that, you're surely placing value on the wrong thing. Because actually, as James says, if that ends up being where you place value on, say, looking a certain way, looking like a certain person you want to emulate, the inputs that you put into all of those things will be inputs that don't match the true values that are inside of you. So the sort of person you are might be completely different to the person you're looking at on social media. But if you've placed value on just the appearance of that person, just the look or the thing that they've attained, the thing they have, the achievement that they've made, or even just the component they've managed to buy or acquire in life, those things may not align with your values. So if you're putting all your value on achieving that thing, as you go through the journey to get there, it's never going to work because the intrinsic values that are in you aren't aligned with the values that you're placing value on. And if you can relate that to what James Allison was talking about there, it's the same reason Mercedes weren't able to be successful during the last couple of years, because they were placing value on the wrong inputs, as he said, at the analytical level. For us, that analytical level is the sort of conscious level, the things we think about, maybe having seen social media or whatever else is around us. We then consciously choose to place value on a certain element of what we might be doing, of the things we might say, of what we might post on social media. But those values are not the true values that are inside of us. And understanding those values is critical to getting the right end result out of the other side, in the same way that Mercedes have had to uncover the true values, or the real values, the accurate values that will lead to the end goal that they want. which of course is to be the best Formula One team they can be. It's to have the fastest car, the most reliable car, the car that will be most usable, the car that has the sort of widest operating window, something they've really struggled with in recent times. They're now figuring out what the true inputs should be, where to place their value. And I think it's a really valuable experience for us to go through. It's almost an audit of ourselves and how we're operating. Businesses, by the way, have to go through exactly the same thing. And I know a Formula One team is a business, but we're talking in James Allison's context there about the idea of the sporting side of Formula One. But from a business perspective, it's actually no different. You need to understand what your end goal is and how you're going to get there and what inputs are required to create that journey and that pathway to get to the other end in the most efficient way, but surely in the most successful way too. And I can think back to moments in my F1 career. Think back to the early days at McLaren, the early Ron Dennis years, or my early Ron Dennis years. I'm almost convinced, and I don't know if Ron would agree with me if I asked him this, but I'm almost convinced that Ron put too much value on the things that he believed in that weren't necessarily in line with the values of the people in the organization. And what I mean by that is Ron was obsessed with the way that the organization and the people in the organization, the factory, the garage, the cars, he was obsessed with the way they looked. Appearance was everything to him. And when I say he was obsessed with it, I mean he was obsessed. Like I've not seen anybody be obsessed about anything to that level before. So it's not that he was wrong in placing some value on that, because the idea of appearance, particularly in Formula One, particularly when you're trying to attract sponsors and partners, is hugely important. It can be really important in life, and we've touched on this in the podcast in previous episodes. Your appearance can give off an understanding to other people of who you are, who you represent, maybe even what your values are. So the appearance is important. But I think the mistake is, and if we call it mistake, again, I'll be open to the fact that Ron may disagree, but my view on this was that Ron over-indexed the importance of that appearance. So in terms of how much value he placed on that, potentially at the expense of the value of other elements of what we were doing, I think cost us. And to give you some context around that, working at McLaren when I first arrived in the early 2000s was a very difficult place to be. I mean, I caveat all of this with the fact that McLaren were very successful at times, but during the early 2000s, we'd gone through a period of success, the Mika Häkkinen years where we'd become world champions, both with him, but also as a constructor. And then when I arrived in the early 2000s, I walked into a factory, into an organization where people weren't necessarily very happy. They weren't loving what they do. They weren't necessarily proud of McLaren. They were complaining. I walked into a world, a dream world for me, having dreamt of getting into that world for a long time, to a world where a lot of people were moaning about what they had to do, about the way that McLaren operated. They were complaining. Now, they were complaining about the fact that it was a really frustrating place to work. Partly from things like a lot of people felt like they spent more time trying to keep their desk tidy, for example, than they ever were able to spend on trying to make the car go more quickly, which would be the obvious way to think about going racing. When I turned up, I felt like that was my job. My job was to try and make this car operate in the most efficient way, to get the best out of it, to work with the drivers, to extract the performance. It was all about performance, going more quickly, getting better results. And yet a large part of my day and my life, it felt like, was having this value placed on something I didn't value nearly as highly. The idea of polishing the desk, keeping the garage spotless at all times, putting a huge amount of time and energy into those things where I'd felt that time and energy perhaps could have been spent better elsewhere. The things that I placed value on back then, to some extent, were different, certainly in their levels of importance, to the things that Ron Dennis placed value on. And in the years that have since me leaving the team, and I've gone into working so deeply with organizations and in team culture, trying to create the right environment to maximize performance, I can't help but look back on that time and think about hundreds of people at McLaren who are complaining and unhappy, and to some extent miserable even, cannot be getting the best performance out of themselves. They cannot be helping the team in the most efficient way to the end result, which has to be trying to win the World Championship. So did Ron get that wrong? Was Ron over-indexing the wrong thing? Were his inputs, because that was a real belief of his, because for him that was a real important value, did that differ with the hundreds of people working inside the organisation? And was the conflict of those two differences, the two different levels of importance of value, was that actually a hindrance to our performance? I can't help but think it must have been, because actually over the early 2000s, and it's not quite this simple, but we didn't win another championship. And it was only when we started to really address that problem, or what I saw as a problem, trying to address the fact that the workforce surely wasn't operating at its maximum potential because a large part of their capacity was spent in things they didn't believe in to the same extent. Now, certainly we weren't ever going to give up this idea of appearance being important. Of course, that was important, and Ron was right in that. But what we did have to address was, were we over-indexing one at the expense of the other? Were we placing the right amount of value as a group, as a team, on the right thing, and therefore were we getting the right thing out at the other end? Because the answer was, what we were getting out at the other end was often a very good car, but it was also often a workforce that clearly were disgruntled and weren't maximising their performance. And when we did address that, when we dialed back a tiny bit, fans and people around the sport may not have even noticed that we dialed that back. Such was the level of attention to detail at McLaren. But internally, we put a lot more focus on the people. We started to realise we had to place a huge amount of value on the people within our organisation. They were our biggest single resource, and yet they'd been massively overlooked at the expense of placing value on other things. That process for us at McLaren was a really enlightening one, in the similar way to we talked about James Allison earlier, being really self-critical and really honest within the group. We had to go through the same process. And I've sat in meetings with Ron Dennis where we have discussed this, and he was open to the idea of introducing changes and looking at the idea of human performance as a metric for the overall team's performance, not just the technical performance that we might have always looked at before. Another idea of placing value on or overlooking value on certain elements. We placed almost all of our resource on the technical side of the car, trying to make the car go a tenth of a lap quicker. We placed almost no resource on the people that enabled that to happen. And as a result of that, they became disgruntled. They became unhappy. They clearly weren't operating at the highest level. So by shifting where we placed value, you can think about it as a group of sort of chips that you've got to deploy. You've got to bet these chips on getting the right outcome. Where are you going to place them? Where are you going to put them on the board? Where you decide to place those chips is intrinsically linked to how the path follows through the journey and what you get out the other side. James Allison is saying they were placing chips on the wrong things. They were placing value on the wrong elements. And he might be talking about the idea of over-indexing aerodynamics at the expense of vehicle dynamics, for example, or vice versa. The reality is they now know from this internal review, this internal investigation, this massively self-critical and really honest process, they now know where they need to spend those chips to get the outcome that the current rule set, the current regulations, the new world of Formula One, what that demands from a car. It's different to the way that it used to be. And so the idea of understanding where you place your value, I think, is an important process that any of us can go through. And as I said earlier, I go through a process like this with organizations that I go and work with on a consultancy basis, but it's no less valuable, important to us. We can do the same thing in the same way that I talked about evaluating how we operate our lives, debriefing our lives. As part of that debrief, we should definitely be looking at what we place value on. Are our values misaligned from the values that we're actually outwardly projecting? And what I mean by that, to go back to what we started this part of the conversation with, are we looking for an outcome that's based on something we've seen on social media, for example, or a friend or somebody else who has something that we don't, somebody that we might look up to, that we might aspire to be like? Are we placing huge value on that end goal or that outcome, as opposed to placing value on the things inside of us that might eventually get us there anyway. Because if we place all our value on the wrong thing, as James said, even if you turn out a car that looks like somebody else's car, you will iterate back to the things you originally placed value on, and therefore you won't get the same result. He's talking about if you just copied a Red Bull and churned out a car that looked like a Red Bull, if inside the organization you're placing value on the wrong things, it won't operate and it won't work like a Red Bull. The car that looks like a Red Bull doesn't necessarily generate the same results as a Red Bull will, because the two organizations might be operating very differently. You think about a Max Verstappen, the inputs you need to put into a Max Verstappen car in terms of the way he drives it, what he demands from it, might be totally different from the inputs required for a Lewis Hamilton car or a George Russell car. They might require different things. Their driving style or their requirements may differ. And therefore, though the car might look the same, it won't matter because it won't perform in the same way because you didn't place the same value internally, intrinsically at that analytical level he's on about at the very beginning of the process. And the same does apply to us. Just dressing like somebody else, doing our makeup in the same way someone else does, aspiring to buy the Ferrari because someone else successful has the Ferrari, doesn't mean we're going to be successful. Looking like somebody doesn't mean we're going to be like that person, because we will inherently place different value to the things that they place value on. And therefore, we could even look like that person, but we won't be that person. And it's the same for a Formula One car. The two are very similarly linked. And that is the kind of thing that this podcast is always looking to uncover and find. It's the links between what Formula One does, and quite often does incredibly well, pushing the boundaries and exploring the finer details of what can generate performance. I think it's wonderful that Mercedes are being as honest as they're being about the journey they've been on, which has included huge struggle to get to a point where now they feel like they've got a path that might lead them much closer to the success that they're after. If we can be that honest as well with ourselves, acknowledge the fact that we have struggled or we are struggling, and then analyze it, be analytical about it. Formula One's very analytical, almost forensic in terms of the detail that we're willing to go to uncover the opportunities that might lie within those struggles. If you can be that detailed, if you can be that analytical, and importantly, if you can be that honest, you might just uncover something that unlocks a path for your future too, in the same way that Mercedes have done. Have a think about it. Go about your week over the course of the next few days, just thinking in that way. Play back that episode with James Allison and Tom Clarkson on F1's Beyond the Grid podcast. Go back and listen to the whole thing and think about it as you're listening in the context of your own life. There is a lot of stuff in that episode, in that conversation, that I found valuable even away from Formula One, and I'm convinced you will find the same. That, folks, is it for the end of this first episode of the brand new season of the Pitlane Life Lessons podcast. I'm so excited to be back. I can't wait for you to meet some of the wonderful guests that will be joining me over the course of the coming season. We've got some brilliant insights from people that have worked in all sorts of roles in Formula One or been touched by this wonderful sport in some way and had it affect their lives. There is a lot to learn, a huge amount, some of which will surprise you. Some of these people you'll know, some of them you may not, but every single one of them has something that I found really valuable, and I'm sure you will too. So look, as ever, I would ask you just one thing, which is completely free. It's a few seconds of your time to go and hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, follow, depending where you're watching or listening to this podcast. I appreciate every one of you, but any one of those interactions, leave me a comment, leave me a 5-star review, hugely important in the way that the algorithm serves up this content to other people. If you can do any of those things, that's all I ask from you. It's massively important and I hugely appreciate it. Thank you for that. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you'll be back next week for more. And in the meantime, as you go through the next week, as I always try and do, try and see what you can do to get a little bit closer to the thing that we always say at the end of these episodes, the thing that I try and navigate my life with, the idea of doing the right things, doing the things right. See ya.